So you want to know more about the first LGBTQ voice published in a major LDS periodical. Today I'd like to introduce you to one of my favorite texts in modern Mormonism. It's also a plea for help because I'd like you to help me identify the author of this important essay, should that information be available. It was published anonymously in Journal of Mormon Thought in 1976, and I will include a link to it in this video description. But even if we don't know who the author was, a lot of the essay is going to sound familiar because it captures many of the central themes of modern LGBTQ experiences in the LDS tradition. It's also a good reminder that when we tell the story of the modern LDS church, we need to find ways to center these voices of LGBTQ saints, not just talk about the institution and the culture in which they inhabited. So in this video, I want to talk about the general context and background to LGBTQ perspectives in the LDS tradition during the post-World War II era. Then I'm going to talk about the essay itself, and then I want to talk about some of the legacies. So let's dig in. Now, it's important to remember that there have been queer voices within the LDS tradition ever since the very beginning, just due to the nature and demographics. It is very likely that there was a large number of queer Latter-day Saints throughout Mormon history, even if their voices are often silenced. Now, scholars have done a lot to unpack this history of homosexuality in America, in religions, in the world in general, and have emphasized this development of identity in which people would, of course, possess and perhaps act on homosexual inclinations, even if they do not identify as homosexual, or that queer identity being a much more modern invention. Now, I specialize in 19th century American history, and there are a lot of what scholars now call romantic friendships between men or women, a way to let out those pent-up desires and frustrations, even if society and the institutions did not allow them. And there have been some really good works on queer experiences and voices and queer love within the LDS tradition, even among some Latter-day Saint leaders. And I want to just introduce one case study, Joseph Fielding Smith. No, not that Joseph Fielding Smith, the one who was the LDS president. Instead, I want to talk about Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the son of Hiram Mack Smith and the grandson of Joseph F. Smith. So Joseph Fielding Smith, the prophet, was the uncle to Joseph Fielding Smith, the patriarch. By the way, I just want to take a moment of pause on how Hiram Mack Smith is about as Mormon a name as you can get, and that he was an apostle. He was the father of Joseph Fielding Smith, who at the age of 43 in 1942 was appointed the LDS Patriarch. Though the position of the LDS Church Patriarch was going through an evolution, maybe I'll do a video in the future of the evolution of this position of an LDS Patriarch that seemed to descend in the Smith family. And notably, when Joseph Fielding Smith became the church patriarch in 1942, the language of that title was reformed from being a church patriarch over to the church to a church patriarch to the church. But then during his tenure in the 1940s, it was discovered that he had a number of homosexual relationships, both when he was a faculty member at the University of Utah, and then as well when he was the patriarch to the church. And while he was punished for those actions, they were treated as discreet indiscretions, and he was mostly banished. He moved to Hawaii. Maybe I'll cover the whole Joseph Fielding Smith story in a future video, but the major lesson is the way they treated homosexuality back then, as seen in the case of Joseph Fielding Smith, was different than how they're going to treat it later. So the changes mostly came starting in the 1950s. This was during an era of nationwide growing attention to homosexuality, in part in response to this sacralization of the nuclear traditional family. This is an invention of a tradition that never really existed, of the nuclear home. And in the 1950s, Spencer W. Kimball and another LDS apostle were assigned to a committee to investigate homosexuality at a local level. And a lot of what we see as the LDS institutional policies on queerness dates from that committee. Eventually, Spencer W. Kimball, as a result of that research and the interviews, publishes his book, Miracle of Forgiveness, one of the most influential, if also one of the most damaging books in modern Mormonism. It reflected this growing concern that homosexuality was deemed a threat. And many across the Christian spectrum were instituting new policies and practices and rhetoric that demonized homosexuality as a danger to society. And it was around that same time in 1968 that homosexuality gets added to the list of excommunicatable offenses for the LDS Church in the church's handbook. And in 1970, a couple of years later, LDS leaders warned in a First Presidency letter to bishops and stake presidents of a, quote, apparent increase in homosexuality. So that should give you some context for then what happens in the 1970s. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of analysis in which we do deep dives into historical topics, and every Friday I do a So You Want to Know More About X topic in which we dig into a particular document or theme or historiographical text, and I pull back the curtains to show how we understand what we know so that you too can be an expert, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And if you like to give back, you can consider becoming a member. I'm very, very grateful for those of you who have decided to support this channel and allow me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to prepare these videos and broaden our understanding. All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. Let me paint the scene for you. It's at the LDS General Conference in the Tabernacle in 1973. President Harold B. Lee, who had just been appointed or ascended to the LDS presidency and would die shortly after this moment, was speaking in the priesthood session. He denounced in his remarks those men who were delaying their duty as priesthood holders to get married. This was a very similar instructions during the era of encouraging people to enter these traditional families, as the nuclear unit of traditional gender roles is becoming the sacred center of the LDS tradition. Among those in the congregation at the tabernacle that day was a 40-year-old man who was still single. When Harold B. Lee gave that accusation of all of you putting off priesthood duties should get married, this 40-year-old man was elbowed by his friends who had attended the session with him. Within the next week, both his bishop and his stake president will call him in to talk to him about the General Conference address, and his own mother would cut out the report of the talk that appeared in the church's Deseret News and sent it to him in the mail so that he could put it up on his fridge. In other words, the lesson for him was clear. It was time for him to get married. He was so stressed over this that he was feeling physical consequences of that external pressure being placed on him, so much so that he started losing his sight. And at that point, he went to go see an eye doctor, and the eye doctor asked, "Are you dealing with any stress right now? Because what you're doing seems to be stress-related physical problems." And it was at that point that for the first time, he said out loud, "Well, it's because I like men more than women." You see, this author had been struggling with his own homosexual identity since a boy, but had been trying to find his way in the church. Eventually, he would write this essay. Here you see the first page, titled Solus, published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. It is likely the first pro-LGBTQ experience published in a major Mormon periodical. Much of the story will sound familiar. This desire that this author had in trying to fit in. He recognized that he was gay early on, and when he was sexually abused as a child, that made him to confront this shame that was embedded within his life and not wanting to talk about his sexuality. And it really scarred him in ways that he was still dealing with decades later. He tried all he could to fit into heteronormative culture. He served a mission. He went to the temple. He was a frequent attendee to church. He held every calling that was giving him. But he also recognized that he didn't fully fit in. In fact, when he was a undergraduate student, he attended a talk by Joseph Fielding Smith, not the patriarch, but the president, Joseph Fielding Smith, when Joseph Fielding Smith was a president, in which he said that homosexuality was filthy and abhorrent, and that he'd rather see his sons dead then come out as gay. You might imagine how hard that would hit this individual, this student who is trying to pave a path in Mormonism despite his homosexual inclinations. Eventually, at some point, he decided he needed to confront this. He went to the church administration building. He waited around long enough to where he could finally meet with an apostle. He didn't say which apostle, and he let it all out to the apostle, telling him, I'm struggling with this, and the apostle counseled, where a lot, 1, to stay faithful, 2, that you'll eventually get over it, 3, start engaging in masculine activities like playing basketball, and also get married. Getting married would be the best way to reform your ways and get over your curse of homosexuality. Now, he tried that for a number of years, but by the time he wrote this essay, the situation looked bleak. He did not really feel like he would ever fit in. He felt alone. And that's why he titled this anonymous essay Solus, which is Latin for alone. And if you do anything else after watching this video, I strongly encourage you to go read that essay, because while I just, touched on the cliff notes, it is a powerful and moving text that really still holds up today. So let's touch on some of the legacies and the consequences that we can glean from this essay, because Solus's story is so common that you might hear from the 1970s. We are getting so many narratives from other, especially gay men, who experience these same dynamics. And unfortunately, we don't have as many perspectives from gay women, given that this structure and this discourse is still predominantly, based on this patriarchal culture. But out of Solus's story, we get the yearning of trying to find a place among the Latter-day Saints. We get the example of gender being a performance, him being told to play basketball and perform other masculine activities. That's a way that, as Taylor Petrie in his wonderful book, Tabernacles of Clay, showed that gender was being molded in ways despite the fact that they claim it is eternal. His counsel to marry a woman, but then not tell the woman about his orientation. Lots of men received similar counsel during that same time, and many, unlike this author, did get married to women, which caused a lot of crises. There's some scholars who are now looking into this broad problem of many of these mixed orientation marriages that come as a direct result of this counsel in the 1970s. You get this sense of homosexuality being something that can be overcome through action, through prayer, that it's not an inborn quality. And you find this sincere desire from the LGBTQ voice, wanting to find a way in the church. They are not a threat. They are not an enemy. They are trying to carve out their own space. Now, thankfully, there have been some things that have changed since the publication of Solus. Around the same time the essay was published, Affirmation, the organization for queer and LGBTQ saints, was founded in 1977. There was both a public outreach as well as underground networks. And so while Solus might have been the first printed voice that touched on these themes, it was far from the last. We've had the Affirmation newsletters that start coming out around that same time. We have books and essays coming out. We have a flood of really great LGBTQ voices now that allow us to now look at that past and reckon with those consequences in ways that it's not nearly as alone as it was when this author wrote his essay anonymously for Dialogue in the 1970s. So in conclusion, I want to repeat that if you do one thing from this video prompts you to do one action. That would be to go to the Dialogue website and read the Solus essay. I will include a link to it in my video description. It is a powerful essay that I think deserves more attention. And also, if you have any hints or understandings or leads on who the author might be, if that author wants to be disclosed or wanted to be disclosed, I hope you'll share it, because I think this is a pioneer who needs to take their prominent place in LDS history. We need to prioritize LGBTQ voices when we talk about modern Mormonism, especially when we talk about the construction of gender and institutional policies, recognizing their sincerity and earnestness, and not just tell the story from the perspective of the church and the church leaders and their wrestling with it. We need to use queer voices to craft our stories in order to fill in these gaps that have long existed. I hope this video made sense. If so, hit the like button and share. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet, and you can become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is today, because it allows us to wrestle with these difficult issues, even in a culture that makes that exceptionally difficult.